Welcome to Southern Vintage Computing. My name is Alan. In today's video, my goal is going to be building a triple boot computer that sits right in the Goldilocks zone of removable computer media. See, I've got 40 some odd years of diskettes, 5 1/4, 3 1/2, double density, high density, tapes for tape drives, zip disks, you name it. I've got so much stuff in here. I've got hundreds and hundreds of discs from across my life, my dad's life, my father-in-law's life, other people's lives have given me discs and computer parts. And it's very difficult, as you know, to just have 3 or 4 different computers spanning 20 years to try to pull data from. And this computer might have a problem, a ROM goes bad, a drive goes bad. I just want to have one computer that can handle 40 years of data all in one spot. And if once I am able to pull the data on one hard drive, then be able to move it easily to any modern computer, right? That's what I want to do. These disks, a lot of my disks are 35, 40 years old. I want to start preserving this data. So I've got 6 requirements for this computer. It's going to give us a very narrow window of computers to pick from here. So number 1, this thing's got to be able to boot an MS-DOS natively on the metal with no problems, no fuss. Number 2, the BIOS needs to be able to handle old double density drives. It also needs to have support for more than one floppy drive. As some of you may know, Pentium 4s and newer, if it even has floppy support, it'll give you support for one drive, 1.44 megabyte, something like that. And that's pretty much all you get. This thing needs to have at least 2 floppy support on it, okay? And all the old stuff going back to the 80s is what I need. So it's got to be an older computer, all right? Number 3, need to have a parallel port. Interlink, interserver, DOS, be able to connect an older computer to it, do some file transfer that way. A lot of newer stuff from mid-2000s on doesn't have that. So that's that requirement. Number 4, some people call it ISA, some people say ISA. That's going to be another requirement there. I've got a lot of old cards in my possession. I want to be able to pop some of those things in at my leisure. Number 5, I need this computer to also have USB support, right? So that pushes us closer to the more post late 90s, 2000s era, right? So now we're getting into some big asks here, right? Number 6, I need this computer to also be fast enough to hold enough RAM, have a good enough processor to handle Windows XP and a Linux flavor of, let's say, the last 20 years, okay? I want the extremely good USB support of Windows XP. I want to plug and play whatever I want into this thing and have it just work, right? Windows XP is that tool for that. There's also various 32-bit programs I want to be able to run easily on this computer. There's certain good disk imagers and stuff like that out there that really just want to run well on Windows. So I want to have a Linux partition on this thing. Linux. Those of you who are Linux users out there know that there's a few things that Linux does well. One of my favorite, most useful commands in Linux is the dd command. Very powerful. You can pull data from any part of any drive that you can mount, turn it into a file, an image file, take it from an image file, mount it if you want to, and whatever the FAT16, FAT32, NTFS, whatever file system Linux has got a lot of support for. You can mount it, read and write to it, and so on. You can take those bits of data and you can stick it back into a floppy disk if you want, or a hard disk image, or whatever. Linux is very powerful in that, and I want Linux for the data manipulation there. So this is, like I said, a big ask to have these 3 things. This puts us in a window, a very narrow window of, let's say, the late 90s, right? It's going to be something newer than a 46, and it's going to be something older than a Pentium 4. Like I said, about a narrow window of 2-3 years there. I've got a lot of different boards to choose from. I've got a big collection of parts and pieces and everything that we're going to go through and put this thing together. I think we're going to go look at a couple of my Pentium boards and see if one of my Pentiums might be the good base for this. Let's have a look. Here we go. I think we've got a good contender here. This one is a E139-761 motherboard. This particular one, the socket 7, has got a Pentium 233 MMX in it. And comes with 2 RAM slots. The good thing is here, this is a decent candidate, 4 PCI and 3 ISA slots. Looks like there's already some dusty old cards in here. All right, so only drive that's in this one here is going to be, interestingly, a tape drive. Everything else has been gutted at some point from this thing. That's fine because we're going to put in our own drives anyway. So let's go ahead and get some drives together. I'm going to go ahead and do all the dirty work of putting this stuff in. I need both of my hands, and then we'll take a look at what I come up with. Okay, here's what we got in here. I have got, at this point, 256 megs of RAM. I know that Linux is going to need at least that. That should be good enough for that. Windows XP, I believe, is fine with around 64. Likes a little bit more like 128, but this should be more than adequate for XP. The 233 MMX should handle both, especially with Linux if we use a really lightweight version, something with maybe XFCE window management. So that's what we'll look at for that. For drives, I have got something that would have been mind-blowing in 1998. By the way, this is a 1998 board. In 1998, this Quantum Fireball 20 gigabyte drive would have been out of this world. Back in the late 90s, typical drive size for us would have been 500 megs to a gigabyte or so. By 2000, I think my largest drive at the time back then, when I was a teenager, was about 6 gigs. So 20 is fantastic. We're going to format this thing with a partition 2 gig max for DOS, maybe 8-10 gigs for Windows, and the rest for a couple of Linux partitions. So there's our main hard disk. For our disk drives, let's start here. We've got a Sony 1.44 meg, ubiquitous. They made tons of these in the 90s. So there's one of those, nice and clean in there. We have next up a TIAC 1.2 megabyte high density 5 1/4 drive. This thing is in perfect working order. So he is there. We also have a 360K drive. This took me a little while to dig through my piles of drives to find one that's 360K. This one is a Toshiba, if I remember. Came out of an 8086 leading edge computer. It had 2 disk drives, no hard disk. That computer had a lot of problems. I went ahead and pulled the drives out of it. I did not feel one bit guilty about it. This drive has been tested. It also works great. We have a zip drive. This is one of my nice internal mount zip drives. I got a couple externals. I wanted to have an internal one here, and then a no-name CD-ROM drive. So the reason here for 2, a lot of people may be asking me, well, why, Alan, would you put in a 360K when you've already got the functional 1.2 meg? Well, some of you may know, some of you may not know, the drive heads on the 1.2 megs are much smaller. The read-write heads are much smaller than on the 360K drives, and so when you take a 360K disk, put it in here, for the most part, these will read the old 360K double density floppies just fine, but if you try to overwrite them, if you try to write onto them, the head will have a much more narrow band of data spread, and so on either side on the track, you'll have the old data that's still there, and it'll confuse the drive in the future, especially if you stick it back into one of these, and it'll start seeing 3 strips of data, the 2 strips of old 360K data, and then the little middle strip of the smaller head, right, of the data from the 1.2 meg. It's just better to natively read and write 360K with a 360K only double density drive. And that is why we did this. Zip drive. In my possession, I have something like a dozen or 15 or so zip disks. I don't have a lot. They were expensive even back in the day. They are more expensive now, but it's very nice because with these, you can use zip disks to attach to older computers, PC XTs. I've used zip drives on XTs. You have an automatic freebie 100 megabyte hard drive. Basically, with this, it's great for mass data transfers to older computers. and then of course CD-ROM. We need that to install Windows and Linux. So let's get to our next step and talk about installing our operating systems. Here are our operating systems we're going to be attempting to put in here together. I have got, of course, for the Microsoft people, genuine Microsoft DOS 6.22 diskettes there, Windows XP, and the Linux version I have researched and landed on Xubuntu 606. Of course, is a i386 compile, so it will run fine on this Pentium. At least I hope it does. This build is from somewhere around 2006 or so, so only about 8 years newer than the Pentium that I've got in there right now. It should hopefully handle it. Like I said, new enough that I've got most of the features I want with it, old enough that it will probably squeak by with the 256 megs of RAM that is on this computer. So let's go ahead and get started. I think what we need to do is put MS-DOS in here first. This is a 20 gig hard drive. MS-DOS could only recognize up to, I believe, 8 gigabyte drives, and at that only in 2 gigabyte partitions. Being that this thing cannot even see the entire 20 gigabytes, we're gonna go ahead and put this thing in there first. Let it have the first 2 gigs of the drive. Let it format it natively, FAT16, do its install. We should be able to overwrite the master boot after that with Windows, Linux, all that. MS-DOS won't care. We'll just have both of these, whichever one we have the master of the master boot record, we'll just have it point to the MS-DOS partition. That should be fine. So we'll go ahead and start with this one, and then we'll see which tug of war, which one we want to put grub bootloader or let Windows be the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Let's try this and just go ahead and start with DOS. So here we go. In addition to your 3 MS-DOS setup disks, you're also going to want to have a spare disk formatted with a DOS 622 boot system on it. And you want a couple of files, in one particular fdisk, and you're going to want format. And what you're going to do with this is you're going to use fdisk. Start the computer with this disk, put fdisk on, partition out your first 2 gigabytes. It's only going to recognize 8 gigabytes, like I said earlier. You format the 2 with fdisk partition, format it, and then you'll restart, you'll go in, you'll put in the setup disk, and then once setup goes through its routine, it'll scan the system and go, oh, you've got a 2 gig partition, we're calling that C, and we're going to go forward. It's very easy. I don't need to show it. fdisk is super duper, super simple. Anybody can do it, so I didn't feel like I needed to show that, but I did want to explain this. MS-DOS setup will not let you do your partitions yourself, so go ahead and do it that way as a first part of your setup. And then now we're going to go ahead and start the install on DOS. So it's going to copy from the diskettes. It'll go through, get to about 30%, ask me for the next one. And as we get closer to done, I'll come back. We are just about done here as we roll up to 99, 100%. Here we go. We are ready to roll. Let's go ahead and reboot this thing. I got a few things installed. We're going to install a simple mouse driver for my little serial port mouse here. We're going to install the Oak CD driver, MSCD executable, and then come back when we've got all that rolling. All right, successfully booted. We gave DOS the first 2 gigs. There's the CD-ROM driver. There's the mouse driver. Let's have a look here. Oops, D-I-R. Boom. I did go ahead and install a few more things on there, so I see a few hundred megs taken up. I could not help myself. I went ahead and put a bunch of stuff on the computer, but we are good to go. So we're gonna go ahead and move on to our next items here. Come back in a second. Okay, so we've got our boot from CD popped right up. We are going to try this out, see how this works. This is a good sign. Okay. Yeah, this whole thing's not gonna have support for that. It's fine. This is promising. All right, I'm thinking about it. I would imagine that this is going to push this computer very hard. I'm gonna give this thing a couple minutes and we will come back so that you don't have to sit here and watch the entire progress bar load. Okay, Linux finally loaded. It took a solid 7 or 8 minutes for the live CD to load everything into RAM. A little slower than I thought, but I'm not surprised. First off, the 9-pin serial mouse is not working. It worked on DOS fine. I tested it. It is not responding in Linux. So one of the main reasons why I wanted a USB port on this computer so that I could go ahead and plug on one of these real quick and get this taken care of. We'll figure out the serial port mouse later on for Linux. This is not a big deal breaker. So I have gone ahead and already handled all my partition work. Here is our 2 gig FAT16. Now this was done by DOS itself. I did not use gparthead or GNOME partition editor to do this. That 2 gigs, and you can see DOS put its boot flag on there and all that good stuff. I have gone ahead and put NTFS in here under this main extended partition. That's the way it likes it. I gave 10 gigabytes to Windows. I went ahead and threw a 500 meg roughly Linux swap in there just because this thing's kind of pinched for RAM at 256. Linux probably wants a little more breathing room. That'll be fine. Here is our Linux boot for Grub to go into. And then I didn't bother separating out the home folder, any of that. Home, the binaries, everything can just go into the main HDA8 partition, and the Linux operating system can just throw it all in that one. I'm not worried about it. I'm not going to have multiple Linux flavors on here, so I don't need to have a separate home partition. Anyway, we have done it this way because this is an eminently better partition manager than the Windows XP partitioner. This thing's totally graphical. You can literally just see where your partitions are going. I use this partition manager anytime I'm going to format a new system, new hard drive. I never use anything else other than this. So this is the way you want to do it. We're going to go from here. Windows should just see this and not even need to format it. We'll probably format it anyway, but the ideal here would be I like Grub bootloader personally myself better. So I would really want Linux to be the host operating system of the 3 here, ideally. But we'll see how this works out. Okay, at this point I'm going to give a status update on this whole thing. So I did run into a couple of snags. I've been at this for several hours, and something that happened, first of all, Windows XP installed fine. It saw DOS and all that good stuff. I went back in with Xubuntu and installed it. Grub accurately saw the Windows XP partition, it saw the MS-DOS partition, everything worked as it should. Like I said, I wanted Grub to be my main bootloader. Familiar with it, I'm used to it. And so the problem developed where the Grub bootloader would come up. You'd have the three options. Linux would boot fine, of course. And then I would have one go where I would boot Windows XP and it would launch fine. The first time, and only one time, it would launch fine. And from that point forward, the DOS partition was permanently lost, okay? And lost as in no longer bootable, right? The files and everything would still be there. It's not like there's anything critical in there anyway. Blow the whole drive up and start over again if I have to, but that's not the point. It ceased being bootable. I did the whole thing again. I installed everything again. And in the exact same manner, DOS, Windows, Linux. I tried the other way. I booted an MS-DOS first, and it gave me one time. MS-DOS would boot fine, everything would go through, I'd restart the computer, Windows XP would no longer be bootable. Okay, so I began researching, looking into what the problem might be. Well, for whatever reason, because Windows is not at that point the owner of the master boot record, it was upset that it could not see it, that it had ownership master boot record, and it was saying the other DOS partition, and it was going in there, and both partitions seeing each other somehow was a conflict. And so I put in some extra commands into Grub, part tool, and then tried to hide the DOS partition when Windows was booting, and I put the reverse in, unhiding DOS and hiding the Windows partition when DOS would boot up. And same thing would happen. You know, the theory, of course, being that if, Windows is upset that DOS is there, fine, I'm just not going to let it see it. Now, that's not ideal because I want this computer to have Linux and Windows be able to see DOS and so on. But whatever, I was making the attempt here. That didn't work either. In fact, hiding the partitions, it would end up hiding one and running the other, but then for whatever reason in Grub, when I was unhiding partitions, it just wouldn't work. And then both of them ceased being bootable, DOS and Windows. So I said, okay, let's try again another different way. Perhaps let's see if we just let Windows XP be the 800-pound gorilla. Let it own the computer. Let it write over the master boot record, that first 512 bytes of the drive, and we'll let Linux and DOS be the secondary operating systems. I don't think Linux would care. MS-DOS has no idea what's going on, being such an archaic operating system. So I said, let's go ahead and try this. So I spent another couple hours putting Linux on right after MS-DOS, and then I stopped myself. And I asked the question, and I tested, by the way, Linux and DOS together. Interchangeable. This is before Windows goes back on the computer, right? Just a blank NTFS partition there. Linux booted fine. Grub would load MS-DOS fine. I could go back and boot Linux, go back and boot DOS, and so on and so forth. Both were completely agreeable with each other, totally fine. And with that, I said, okay. I told you one of my favorite commands in Linux is the dd command. It occurred to me that the Windows bootloader doesn't just have to point to partitions. It can, of course, do that. It can also point to files. You can go tell it to point straight to a file to start up. So it occurred to me, if I have a functional master boot record right now with Linux and DOS that are completely fine with each other, why don't I go in and do a data dump of the master boot, like a little 512 byte file, and I'm just going to call it linuxmbr.img, right? Linux master boot.img. And I went and pitched that. I just went ahead and threw it on my DOS partition right there. The first partition, I just threw it right in there with config sys and command.com and all that, iosys. And you know what? We're just going to put this there. And if my theory is correct, I would be able to put Windows on there. It would obliterate the Linux master boot, and it would install its Windows master boot data and all that in there. The latter part of the master boot record is also your partition data. Now the partition data hasn't changed, so that's fine. I can let Windows overwrite all that because it's going to be the same partition data. After all, we already partitioned everything using gparthead earlier, right? So that's fine if it overwrites that, because it's just going to go back to the same data with that. The only difference is going to be Windows bootloader now. Okay, so I put Windows on here, and before we did anything else, I went in and edited the Windows bootloader and put MS-DOS first, put Windows XP as the second option, because I want this thing to just natively boot MS-DOS. That's the quickest one. And then we can pick number 2 Windows, number 3 Linux, okay? And I pointed to the file, c/linuxmbr.img, and I want to show you what resulted. All right, so first things first, as you can see, Windows XP installed. It's up and running fine. It's actually not bad at all, rather speedy enough on this computer. First thing of note, number 1, my 9-pin serial mouse works just fine here. Secondly, because of our BIOS support of the old double density drives, this thing picked right up on the 360K floppy, which is what I've got on the slave side of the cable. The 1.44 right now is drive A. It was reading and writing to both of them just fine. I just tested it a second ago, so we're good there. That's fantastic that Windows XP sees all that. Next, let's talk about the booting. Here is that file that I did a data dump on. You see the 512 bytes. Here is our master boot record that I saved before installing Windows, mind you. This is before Windows, when we just had DOS and Linux on here, as I mentioned a minute ago. Most of this right here is going to be your Linux boot, and then the latter portion of here is going to be partition data. And I stuck that right here, right next to the Windows XP bootloader. You can see it threw it all right in here. It's very strange that it did that, but it wanted to put it on C rather than D drive where Windows XP is. This Windows right here is 3.1. This is the DOS partition, right? But I've got all this in here. So now let me show you the Windows boot INI right there. So here's our boot order. I got the timer at 20 seconds, give myself a little time to decide what I want to do. Then the default, this just means where it's on the list of your 3 options, which one is it highlighted first. I didn't change it, I left it Windows, even though MS-DOS is going to be option number 1. And like I said before, you can just point to a partition or a file, however you want to do it with the Windows bootloader. So in here, literally just putting in C drive is enough for it to go load MS-DOS, because the MS-DOS partition, it flags itself as bootable. The system files are where it needs to be. So all you gotta do is put C in there, and that's good to go. And there's MS-DOS 62 is our option. Next is on partition number 2, Windows. You know, it's the disk number 0. There's only one hard disk in here, so disk 0, partition 2, Windows XP. Ended up putting professional on here. Got a copy of that in home. I just went ahead and put professional on, no big deal. So there's that. You can see that it booted fine. And then down here is our gamble. Here is my thought. Put in here C, and then since we know it can go to a drive, I went ahead and just said, hey, let's just go ahead and try pointing it to C drive and then straight to this Linux file. In theory, this is going to look at this and say, going into it, it's going to read that and forget all about the fact that the master boot record has the Windows bootloader on it. It's going to basically restart the process again as if Linux owns the master boot record, because then it's going to go in there and see that Linux is on the same partition it's always been on, and it's going to boot it. Now, what I did was, since Grub is no longer going to be my number one, master bootloader for everything, I went ahead and pulled out all the options except for Linux, and I zeroed out the timer on it so that it just appears to go straight to Linux. Even though Grub is still booting, Grub is still doing its thing, and you could technically have the options there. I am not going to risk having Grub mess up whatever was going on with the DOS and Windows partitions. So let's go ahead and do a reboot of this, and let me show you how this works. See if our theory was proven right. So here we go, shutting down. Give it a little second here. Not too bad on time. Here we go. There we are. Let's do our RAM check. There's our Pentium MX 233, 1998 board. Yeah, I like how it still shows the base 640K even as late as the late 90s. There's our 256 megs of extended RAM. Boom, here we go. And give me my bootloader, all right? So you've seen Windows XP run. Let's see MS-DOS boot. Here we go. This won't take but a second. Boom. MSCD executable. Here's this. Here's the mouse and DOS. That all works. That's great. I have installed Windows 3.11 on it. And I forgot to mention earlier when we we're going over the computer components, I put a 4 megabyte Matrix Millennium 2 into this thing. And the reason I use that and not something later, like number one, this thing does not have an HEP slot, so I was limited to older stuff. But the Matrix Millennium 2 is an absolutely fantastic, gorgeous, rich color graphics card. I do not have any 3DFX cards in my possession. That would be great. I don't have any Voodoos. But anyway, the Matrix Millennium, I had one as a kid on I think one of my mom's computers, and it was a great card. So I went ahead and put one in here. I think this card was from 1997 or so. This thing is great. I've already got it installed. Supports enormous amounts of colors, all kinds of different graphics modes. I've already installed the Win32-bit, which allows you to run NT351 stuff on Windows 3.1. It all works. And so yeah, we'll go ahead and close that out. And we're going to restart this thing for the grand finale. We are rebooting now. And we're going to take a look and see about our Linux partition. Let's check and see if this is going to work out the way we planned. Okay. Check our drives. Got the beep. Give me my menu. And let's see here. Drum roll. And there it goes. There it goes. Wonderful. Here we go. And it's loading, and it should be considerably faster than the live CD that we had. Hopefully. Here we go. Yes, this is loading faster than that live CD. Fantastic. Yep, there it goes. All right, fantastic. So we've got officially at this point MS-DOS, Windows XP, Xubuntu, Linux 6, all together running rebootably. I just made up an adverb. Rebootably, cooperating with each other. Windows XP, interestingly enough, as the holder of the master boot record. But what we have done here is fooled the computer into thinking we've got two different master boot records. So we'll go ahead and let this thing finish out, come back in a second. Well, I was right. The boot process only took about a minute, and we were on our merry way, much faster than the live CD, which is great. And I have already been messing around with this thing. I was able to load this in, mount this disk on FD1, dev FD1. Of course, the 144 drive is dev FD0. I was able to mount this just fine. I was able to do a data dump of this one right here. Actually, sorry, got a copy of, there it is, Norton Commander 4, because this is the last version, by the way, of Norton Commander that runs on an XT. I have an XT under the desk over here. It's got a tantalum capacitor problem, so it's not running. But anyway, I got an old copy of NC4. I just popped it in there. This is, by the way, my old DOS 622 interlink interserver disk from a long time ago. These data life and verbatim disks were always very, very good. And so all these, both of these were no corrupted data, no data loss. Anyway, I was able to pop this in there, and it made a perfect 360K disk image, no problems. Mounted it a second ago in the terminal. It was able to mount, read the files, manipulate it with the disk no longer in there, is using that as the disk rather than this. I am very pleased with how this turned out. I did it as well with another random disk. I did it, let me see here. Oh yeah, here we go. Used a copy. I own this disk natively anyway, but I used a copy MS-DOS 622 supplemental disk. Just popped a high density 1.44 in there just to see if it would do that one, and as you can see, it dumped all that as well, no problems. So just testing the drives, testing out. This is one of the reasons why I wanted Linux in here, is for this kind of disk imaging manipulation natively. So this computer is officially doing everything that I want it to do. Okay, so although it did take reinstalling Windows and Linux a couple times more than I really wanted to, we did learn some things. Windows just wants to be the owner of the master boot when it comes to having a DOS partition involved as well. And Linux is fine being passenger seat. DOS doesn't care where it is. Windows wanted to be the boss here. I am sure that some of you out there know a better way to do this, to still have Grub be the master of all three operating systems. My solution maybe was a bit unorthodox. It's just something I thought up. It worked, so I'm going to stick with it. Pointing to the file image of the former Linux master boot record when it owned it. You can see all three are bootable. I've gone back a few more times just to make sure everything still comes up fine. Linux can see the NTFS partition and the DOS partition. Windows can see the DOS partition. Of course, it's not going to read the ext3 file system, but that's all fine. This thing's doing what I wanted to do. The Matrix Millennium was a perfect video card for this because it's got plenty of DOS support. Windows XP picked it up just fine. Linux saw it just fine. So really a good graphics card for all three flavors of operating system there. I can't complain with how this turned out, other than spending a few hours extra than I wanted to. We got this to work. So now I have an archival computer that can read most of the last 40 years. Double density, high density, 3.5 drives, 5.25 drives. Got our zip drive on here. I have not tried the zip drive yet. I'm sure it's going to be fine. I don't foresee any issues with that. That's probably going to be the one drive I have problems with now that I said that. Of course, but that should be okay. And then the only other drive I can think of that we could put back on here at some point is the tape drive. I've got a handful of tapes. I think some of it was my dad's data backup from his business. At some point, we'll get those at some point. But yeah, since I've got most of the 5 1/4 slots in this thing, or all of them are taken up, we'd have to put the tape drive in one of those. Anyway, so I've got the computer that I want, Pentium 233 MMX. It handled Linux fine. It handled Windows just fine. I have nothing but praise for how this turned out. I'm glad that we were able to figure this out, get our triple boot, get our USB support, our old drive support, a 20 gig drive to be able to archive everything onto, and then if we archive so much that we run out of that space, it's easy enough to pop in a couple gigabyte USB drive and move it to one of my more modern computers. It's got terabytes of space. So this is fantastic. I have punched the easy button on all of my mini piles of diskettes. There's some 5 1/4 stuff over there. I have got bags and bags and bags. Anyway, I can talk all night about all this. I'm gonna go ahead and declare this a victory. I hope you enjoyed the process and the video, and seeing my build office in here. Have a good one.